The explosion ripped the soul from the sleepy afternoon. A cloud of dust and splintered wood billowed from the front of the redemption bank, followed by the jagged symphony of shattering glass. Inside, the air was a thick, choking fog of plaster and cordite. Jake lay on the floorboards at the side of his head, screaming where it had connected with the polished oak counter. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard the calm, authoritative voice of the man orchestrating the chaos. "The vault, Mr. Abernathy, if you please." Jake pushed himself up on one elbow, his vision swimming. 4 men, their faces hidden by dusty bandanas, moved with practiced efficiency. 2 held the terrified customers and tellers at gunpoint, while a third stuffed wads of cash into a canvas sack. But it was the 4th man, the leader, who commanded the room. He stood apart, dressed not in a bandit's rags, but in the tailored coat of a wealthy cattleman. His face was uncovered, a deliberate act of arrogance. Silas Blackwood. His voice was a low, cultured baritone that was completely at odds with the violence he commanded. "There's a good man," Silas cooed as the trembling bank manager fumbled with the combination to the vault. Jake's only thought was to stay down, to be just another face in the crowd. His days of facing men like Silas were supposed to be over-buried under 6 feet of dirt along with his past. He had a ranch to run, a quiet life. He had clawed back from the brink of despair. He was no longer the man he used to be. He couldn't be. But Silas wasn't just there for the money. As the vault door swung open and his man began to loot it, Silas's gaze swept the room, cold and calculating. It passed over the cowering townsfolk, the weeping teller, and then it landed on Jake. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips, a smile of recognition, of satisfaction, of hunger. "Well, I'll be Silas," said his voice, cutting through the panicked silence. "Look what the dust blew in, the ghost of the canyons hiding amongst the sheep." He strode toward Jake, his polished boots clicking ominously on the floor. 2 of his men fell into step behind him, their pistols leveled at Jake's chest. The quiet life Jake had so carefully constructed crumbled to dust in that single moment. "Get up, Jake," Silas commanded. Jake rose slowly, his hands held out to his sides, palms open. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of a life he thought he'd escaped. "I don't want any trouble, Blackwood." "Oh, I think you do." Silas purred, circling him like a vulture. "Trouble has a way of finding you, doesn't it? It follows you like a shadow, a debt that's never quite paid." He stopped directly in front of Jake, his eyes dark and piercing, locking onto the thin silver chain around Jake's neck. "What's this trinket reminder of happier times?" Before Jake could react, Silas's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around the chain. He yanked hard. The silver snapped, and the locket, small, oval, and worn smooth with years of touch, fell into Silas's palm. A cold, primal rage, an emotion Jake hadn't felt in years, surged through him. "No." He growled the word torn from his throat. He lunged his fist, connecting with Silas's jaw with a satisfying crack. It was a foolish, impulsive act, the ghost of the gunslinger refusing to stay dead. The impact sent Silas stumbling back, surprise flickering in his eyes, before it was replaced by a venomous fury. "You shouldn't have done that," he hissed, rubbing his jaw. His men didn't wait for an order. The butt of a rifle crashed into Jake's ribs, stealing his breath. Another blow caught him behind the knees, sending him to the floor. A boot connected with his stomach, then his face. The world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of pain and flashing lights. Through the haze, he saw Silas looking down at him, opening the silver locket. Silas stared at the miniature portrait inside, his expression unreadable, before snapping it shut. "This," Silas said, his voice a low promise of pain, "is just the beginning. I'm not just going to take your land, Jake. I'm going to take everything you have left. I'm going to watch you lose it all, piece by piece, until you have nothing but the dust you crawl in." He tucked the locket into his vest pocket, then gestured to his men. "We're done here." They were gone as quickly as they had appeared, leaving behind a wrecked bank, terrified citizens, and Jake bleeding on the floor, the empty space on his chest colder and more painful than any of his physical wounds. He had lost more than a piece of silver. Silas Blackwood had just stolen the last tangible piece of his wife. And in doing so, he had resurrected the one man Jake had sworn he would never be again. The sun was a merciless hammer against the anvil of the sky, beating down on the parched earth of Jake's ranch. Red sand glowed like embers under its unforgiving glare, and the skeletal arms of saguaros reached for a cloudless sky, their silent plea for rain unanswered. This land was harsh, but it was honest. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was: a place of survival, of grit, of solitude. It was the perfect place for a man to bury his past. Jake sat on the porch of his small, sturdy cabin, dabbing a wet cloth at the gash on his cheekbone. Every muscle ached, a brutal reminder of the saloon floor. But the physical pain was a dull echo compared to the hollow ache in his soul. He could still feel the phantom weight of the locket against his skin, a constant, agonizing absence. His gaze drifted to the single well-tended grave under the shade of a lone mesquite tree. Sarah, 1855-1878. Beloved wife. A memory sharp and vivid, cut through the haze of his pain. A summer evening years ago, the air sweet with the scent of desert blossoms after a rare rain. Sarah, her face illuminated by lantern light, her eyes shining with a love that had felt infinite. She had pressed the locket into his hand. "So you'll always carry my heart with you," she had whispered, her fingers tracing the delicate engraving on the silver. "No matter how far you ride." He had been a different man then. A man whose name was spoken in hushed tones in saloons from Kansas to the border. A man whose speed with a Colt was his trade and his curse. Sarah had seen past the gun smoke and the reputation. She had seen the man he could be. It was for her that he had hung up his guns, for her that he had bought this small patch of unforgiving land. He had promised her a quiet life, a safe life. The promise had died with her, taken by a fever that swept through the territory like a wildfire, indiscriminate and cruel. All he had left of that promise was this land, this cabin, and the locket. Now the locket was gone, and the land was being choked slowly and deliberately by Silas Blackwood. For months, Blackwood had been a creeping plague. He'd bought the Miller place to the east, the Harrison spread to the south. He'd dammed up the creek that fed Jake's watering hole, forcing him to dig a new well by hand. Every move was a calculated squeeze designed to isolate him, to force him to sell the last piece of the puzzle that was Blackwood's growing empire. Until yesterday, Jake had thought it was just business, ruthless but impersonal. The robbery, the deliberate theft of the locket had changed everything. This wasn't about land. This was about him. The sound of an approaching horse pulled him from his reverie. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Sheriff Miller's horse had a distinctive weary gait, much like its owner. The old lawman dismounted with a groan, his face a roadmap of resignation under the brim of his sweat-stained hat. "Jake," he said, his voice raspy with trail dust. He nodded toward Jake's bruised face, heard what happened. In the bank, and then later at the saloon. "Then you heard I got what I deserved for being a fool," Jake said, his voice flat. "You got what you got for standing up to a man who owns this town," is what Miller corrected, easing himself onto the porch step. He pulled a pouch of tobacco from his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. "There's nothing I can do, Jake." Officially. Officially, Jake repeated the word, tasting like ash. Silas Blackwood robs the town bank in broad daylight, assaults a dozen people, and you can't do anything. "I can file a report," the sheriff said, not meeting his eye. which the judge who plays poker with Blackwood every Thursday will file away in a drawer. His men will swear he was 50 miles away, inspecting cattle. It's his word against a bunch of scared folks who won't testify for fear of finding their barns burned down or their wells poisoned. He finally looked at Jake, his eyes filled with a tired sort of pity. He's got a son. He's got this whole valley by the throat. Jake's hands clenched into fists on his knees. He took something from me, Sheriff. Something personal. The locket Miller sighed. I heard. I'm sorry, Jake. Truly. But you're poking a rattler with a short stick. He wants this land. He's made it plain. Maybe the smartest thing to do is just sell. Take the money and start over somewhere new. Somewhere he ain't. The suggestion felt like a betrayal. This land wasn't just dirt and rock to him. It was a sanctuary. It was the last place Sarah had been alive. Leaving it would be like burying her all over again. I'm not selling, Jake said, his voice low and hard as granite. The sheriff sighed again, a long, weary exhalation of defeat. I figured you'd say that. Just be careful, Jake. Blackwood's not a man who likes to be told no. He's got a mean streak born of old grievances. He stood his joints popping in protest and made his way back to his horse. You take care of that face, he said over his shoulder. Wouldn't want to scare the coyotes. Jake watched him ride away, a solitary figure swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The sheriff's visit had confirmed what he already knew. He was alone. The law was a ghost, and the town was a hostage. If he wanted the locket back, if he wanted to keep his home, he would have to do it himself. He'd tried confronting Blackwood head-on in the saloon last night, and all he'd gotten for his trouble was a beating that left him tasting blood for hours. Direct confrontation was useless. Silas was insulated by his wealth and his army of hired guns. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, a cold resolve settled over Jake. He had run from his past for 5 years. He had tried to be the man Sarah wanted him to be, a rancher, a peaceful man. But Silas Blackwood wasn't interested in that man. He was interested in the ghost of the canyons. He had called him out, and maybe it was time for the ghost to answer. He would have to be smarter, more patient. He would have to find a weakness in Blackwood's armor. He had to understand why. Why this obsessive need for this specific piece of land? Why the personal venomous hatred? The answer, he suspected, was buried somewhere in the past, a past he had tried so hard to forget. The saloon doors of the gilded cage swung open, spilling a wave of boisterous noise and stale beer into the dusty street. Jake stepped inside his eyes, adjusting to the dim, smoke-filled room. This was Silas Blackwood's den, and the opulent heart of his power in redemption. Men in expensive suits drank alongside rough-looking ranch hands, all of them orbiting Silas, who sat at a back table like a king holding court. Jake walked toward him, each step deliberate. The saloon quieted as people noticed him, his bruised face a stark testament to his last visit. Men shifted hands, moving instinctively closer to their holsters. Jake ignored them. His focus was solely on Silas. Silas looked up, a flicker of amusement in his dark eyes. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. Back for more, are we? I admire your persistence, if not your judgment. Jake remained standing. Give me back what's mine, Blackwood. Silas chuckled, a low, condescending sound. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. A man of your reputation, reduced to pleading. The fall from grace is a treacherous slope, isn't it, Jake? This isn't about my reputation. It's about a locket. Oh, it's about so much more than a locket, Silas said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate and menacing. He leaned forward. It's about memory. It's about land that holds history. It's about debts that have been left to fester for far too long. He gestured around the saloon. Look at you, trying to play the humble rancher. But I know what you are. Underneath that farmer's dust, the killer is still there. I can see it in your eyes. The words were a calculated strike aimed at the deepest, most painful part of Jake's soul. You don't know anything about me. Jake set his voice tight. I know everything I need to. Silas countered, his smile widening. And all in due time, you'll learn what it feels like to have everything you love turn to dust. He leaned back, the picture of casual command, and gave a slight nod to the two brutes standing behind him. Show our friend the door. Again. Jake braced himself, but before the men could move, the saloon doors burst open again. This time, however, it wasn't noise that spilled in, but a profound and sudden silence. A woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, her fine traveling clothes torn and covered in dust, her dark hair a wild tangle around a face that was pale with exhaustion and fear. But even in her disheveled state, she carried an air of defiance. Her eyes wide and desperate scanned the room, and for a heart-stopping moment they met Jake's. Then her gaze moved on, landing on Silas Blackwood. A look of pure terror followed by furious resolve passed over her features. Silas rose from his chair, his jovial mask slipping to reveal a face of cold fury. Elena, he said the name, a sharp crack in the silence. You have caused me a great deal of trouble. The woman Elena lifted her chin. Not nearly as much as you intended to cause me. She turned and fled. For a second the room was frozen. Then Silas barked an order. Don't just stand there, you fools, get her. His men scrambled for the door, but their path was suddenly blocked. Jake, moving on pure instinct, had stepped in front of them, his arms braced against the doorframe. It was a small act of defiance, but it was enough. The momentary delay gave the woman a precious head start. One of Silas's men shoved Jake hard. Out of the way, rancher. Jake didn't budge. He met the man's eyes, and for the first time in 5 years, he let the ghost look out. He let the cold, deadly calm that had earned him his reputation settle over him. The man hesitated, seeing something in Jake's gaze that gave him pause. That hesitation cost them. By the time they shoved Jake aside and spilled out into the street, Elena was gone, vanished into the labyrinth of alleys and shadows of the town at dusk. Jake was hauled back before a seething Silas Blackwood. You, Silas snarled, his face contorted with rage. You just made a grave mistake. This time the beating was worse. They dragged him out into the alley behind the saloon, away from any potential witnesses. The blows were methodical, intended to punish, to break. As his consciousness began to fade into a haze of agony, the last thing he heard was Silas's voice, a chilling whisper next to his ear. She can't run forever. And when I find her, I'll make sure she understands the price of defiance, a price you will help pay. They left him in a heap in the filth of the alley. Every breath was a shard of glass in his lungs. He lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the town fade as night fell. He had failed. He hadn't gotten the locket back, and he had made his situation infinitely worse. He had just declared himself an enemy of the most powerful man in the valley. And for what? For a woman? He didn't even know. With a groan that was half pain and half despair, he began the slow, torturous process of dragging himself to his feet. He had a long walk back to his ranch and a sinking feeling that his solitary life was well and truly over. The miles back to his ranch were a blur of pain. Each jarring step sent waves of fire through his bruised ribs. He stumbled through the darkness, guided by the cold light of the stars, his mind a maelstrom of failure and fury. When he finally saw the faint outline of his cabin against the horizon, relief was a foreign country he couldn't quite reach. He was nearing the dry creek bed that marked the edge of his property when a flicker of movement in the shadows caught his eye. He froze his hand, dropping instinctively to the empty holster at his hip. He'd left his gun belt at the cabin, a rancher's habit that felt like a fool's mistake now. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice a raw croak. A figure slowly emerged from the shade of a cottonwood tree. It was the woman from the saloon, Elena. She was leaning against the tree trunk as if it were the only thing holding her up. In the moonlight, he could see the fine quality of her dress, now snagged and ripped, and the exhaustion etched into every line of her body. "They told me in town," she said, her voice trembling, but clear, that there was a rancher out this way who wasn't on Silas Blackwood's payroll. A man who kept to himself. "You shouldn't be here." Jake grunted, taking a step closer. He could see now that her ankle was twisted at an awkward angle. "His men are looking for you." "I know," she said. "I saw what you did for me at the saloon, and I saw what they did to you because of it." Her eyes took in his battered face, and a flicker of guilt crossed her own. "I'm sorry." "Sorry doesn't help much right now," Jake said, though the words lacked their intended bite. He limped over to her. "Ankle." She nodded. "I twisted it in the alley. I've been hiding out here for the last hour." He sighed. He should tell her to keep moving, to get off his land and take her trouble with her. He had more than enough of his own. But looking at her defiant, even in her exhaustion and pain, he saw a reflection of his own predicament. She was another person being crushed under the heel of Silas Blackwood. "Come on," he said, the decision made before he was even aware of making it. "You can't stay out here. My cabin's just over that rise." He offered her a hand. She hesitated for only a moment before taking it. Her hand was small, but her grip was firm. He helped her up, letting her lean on him as they made the slow, painful journey to the cabin. Inside, he lit a lantern, casting a warm, flickering glow over the simple Spartan room. He helped her into a chair before fetching the medical kit he kept for ranch injuries. As he knelt to examine her ankle, the silence between them was thick with unspoken questions. "You're the bride, aren't you?" he asked, gently probing the swollen joint. "The one he was supposed to marry." She flinched more from the memory than his touch. "An arrangement. My father's business was failing. Silas offered to save it. I was the price." She looked around the cabin, at the single bed, the rough-hewn table, the empty gun rack on the wall. "This is a long way from the life he promised you." "A promise is a hollow thing when it's made by a hollow man," she said bitterly. "I heard the way he talked about me, about my family. Like we were cattle he was acquiring. I couldn't do it. I couldn't spend my life as another one of his possessions." Her words resonated with him. Another one of his possessions. It was what he was fighting against becoming. He wrapped her ankle tightly with a clean bandage. "That should hold it for now. You need to stay off it." "And go where?" she asked, the fight in her voice giving way to a raw vulnerability. "He'll have men watching the town the stagecoach road. I have nowhere to go." He stood up and looked at her, really looked at her for the first time. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the steel in her spine. She wasn't a damsel in distress. She was a fighter who had run out of ground to fight on, just like him. "You can stay here," he heard himself say, "for a night. Rest up. We'll figure something out in the morning." Her eyes filled with a gratitude so profound it made him uncomfortable. "Why?" she whispered. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." "I know you're running from Silas Blackwood," he said, turning away to stoke the embers in the hearth. Right now, that's enough of a reason for me. Over the next few days, an unlikely alliance formed within the four walls of the cabin. Elena, despite her injury, refused to be idle. She was neat and organized, bringing a sense of order to his bachelor existence that it hadn't seen in years. She insisted on mending his torn shirt, on helping him plan meals from his meager supplies. And she talked. She asked him questions about the ranch, about his life, questions no one had asked him in a very long time. He found himself talking back, sharing small details he thought he'd forgotten. In turn, he learned about her. She was from back east, educated and sharp-witted. She saw the world with a clarity he found both refreshing and startling. She also saw his pain. That locket, she said one evening as they sat by the fire, the one he took. It was important to you. Jake just nodded, his throat suddenly tight. My wife's, he said the word, feeling heavy and unfamiliar on his tongue. She gave it to me. Elena didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. She just sat with him in the silence, her presence a quiet acknowledgement of his grief. Her presence also brought a new focus to his struggle. He was no longer just fighting for himself. He was fighting for her too. And that meant he needed more than just resolve. He needed a plan. He needed to understand the root of Blackwood's obsession. It's not just your land, he wants. Elena said, her brow furrowed in thought. It's this land. He could buy a dozen ranches bigger than this one. Why here? Why is he so determined to drive you out specifically? It was the same question he'd been asking himself. The sheriff said something about him having old grievances. Then we need to find out what they are. She said, her eyes alight with a new idea. People in town are afraid to talk, but there are other ways to find information. Old records, maps. The town doctor, maybe. Old Doc Abernathy has been here since the town was founded. He knows everyone's secrets. It was a long shot, but it was better than sitting here waiting for Blackwood to make his next move. The idea of actively investigating, of going on the offensive, felt better than anything he had felt in days. For the first time, he wasn't just reacting. He was fighting back. And he wasn't doing it alone. The town of Redemption felt different with Elena by his side. Riding in on the buckboard, Jake was acutely aware of the stares they received. He was the reclusive rancher who'd been beaten twice in as many days. She was the mysterious runaway fiancé of Silas Blackwood. Together, they were a walking, breathing provocation to the most dangerous man in the territory. Their first stop was the doctor's office. Doc Abernathy was a stooped, white-haired man with eyes that had seen too much birth and death to be easily surprised. He cleaned and redressed the cut on Jake's face with practiced, gentle hands. Looks like you tried to argue with a mule and lost, the doctor said, his voice a dry rasp. Something like that, Jake replied. He glanced at Elena, who gave him an encouraging nod. Doc, you've been in this valley a long time. You knew my father-in-law. You know pretty much everyone. Comes with the territory, Abernathy said, dabbing ointment on the cut. I've patched up more Blackwoods and delivered more Millers than I can count. Blackwoods, Elena asked, seizing the opening. So Silas's family is from here? The doctor's hands stilled for a fraction of a second. A cautious, veiled look came over his face. They were. One of the first families to settle this valley? His father, Elias Blackwood, owned a huge tract of land. Most of what Silas has now, and then some. What happened to it, Jake asked. Abernathy went back to his work, his movements suddenly brisk. Elias was a card player, a bad one. Drank too much. Lost most of the original ranch bit by bit over the years. Some say he gambled away his boy's birthright. Boys, Elena prompted gently, Silas has brothers. The old doctor sighed a weary sound that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. He put away his supplies and turned to face them, his expression grim. He had one. A younger brother. Caleb. He looked directly at Jake, his gaze sharp and meaningful. There was a tragedy years back. A terrible misunderstanding. The Blackwood family was never the same after that. Elias drank himself into an early grave, and Silas left. Only came back a few years ago, buying up land, making a name for himself. Some folks say he came back to reclaim his family's honor. Others say he came back for revenge. The doctor's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Jake felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. A tragedy. A younger brother. The past he had tried so desperately to bury was beginning to stir. "Thank you, Doc," Jake said, his voice strained. He left a few coins on the table and led Elena out into the blinding sunlight. "What was that about?" Elena asked, her eyes searching his face. "The way he looked at you when he said tragedy." "I don't know," Jake lied, the words tasting like poison. But he did know. Or at least he was beginning to be terrified that he did. Their next stop was the county records office, a dusty, neglected room in the back of the sheriff's building. The clerk, a nervous man named Peters, was reluctant to help them, his eyes constantly darting toward the door, as if expecting Silas Blackwood himself to materialize. But Elena had a way about her. With a mixture of polite persistence and disarming charm, she convinced him to let them look at the old property maps of the valley. They spent hours poring over the brittle, yellowed paper. The maps told a story of changing fortunes. They saw the vast expanse of the original Blackwood Ranch slowly shrinking over the years, parcels of it sold off or lost. And then they found it, an old survey map from 30 years ago. On it, the land that was now Jake's ranch was clearly marked. And in the corner, in faded ink, was the name of the owner, Elias Blackwood. "He owned your land," Elena whispered, her finger tracing the boundary lines. "His father owned your ranch." "He lost it," Jake said, more to himself than to her. "The doc said he gambled it away." But to whom? Elena mused, her eyes scanning the adjacent pages of the ledger. She stopped, her finger landing on a record of sale. He didn't sell it. The records show he lost it in a poker game. "To my father-in-law," she read, her voice laced with disbelief. "To your wife's father, Walter Page." The pieces slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. Silas wasn't just trying to build an empire. He was trying to reclaim what he believed was his ancestral home. The very land where Jake now lived. The land where Sarah was buried. As they walked back to the buckboard, Jake's mind was reeling. He felt Elena's hand slip into his, her touch, a grounding force in the storm of his thoughts. Their shared purpose had forged a bond between them, a quiet understanding that went deeper than words. He had started this fight for a memory, for a piece of silver. Now it was for his home, his future, and for the woman walking beside him. But the doctor's words still echoed in his mind. A tragedy. A younger brother named Caleb. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that the map was only part of the story. The true reason for Silas's vendetta was not written on any map or in any ledger. It was buried. Buried in the past, and maybe buried somewhere on his land. That night, a storm rolled in the wind, howling around the small cabin like a grieving spirit. Sleep offered no escape for Jake. His dreams were a tangled mess of the past and present, Sarah's smiling face, the cold fury in Silas's eyes, the crack of a pistol in a dusty street long ago. He woke up in a cold sweat just before dawn, the name Caleb on his lips. He couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. He needed air. He needed to walk. He pulled on his boots and stepped out into the pre-dawn chill. Elena was already awake, sitting on the porch steps, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up as he approached. "You too?" she asked softly. He just nodded, his gaze sweeping over his land. It looked different now, haunted by the knowledge of its history. He started walking aimlessly at first, toward the rocky outcropping at the northern edge of his property. Elena rose and followed him, her silence a comforting presence. It was a part of the ranch he rarely visited. The ground was too rocky for grazing, the soil too thin for anything to grow. As the first rays of sun crested the mountains, they illuminated something out of place among the rocks and scrub brush. A small, unnatural pile of stones. Jake's heart began to pound. He walked toward it, a sense of dread washing over him. It was a grave, unmarked, untended, almost completely reclaimed by the wilderness. But at its head was a single flat stone, larger than the others. Most of the writing had been scoured away by years of wind and rain, but two words were still faintly visible, carved deep into the rock. Elena knelt beside him, her breath catching in her throat as she read the inscription aloud. "Caleb Blackwood." And then the past came for Jake, not as a dream, but as a memory so vivid it felt like it was happening all over again. A dusty street in a town he could no longer name. He was younger, arrogant, living by the speed of his draw. Caleb Blackwood was even younger, barely a man, full of whiskey and misplaced pride. The argument had been stupid, a misunderstanding over a card game, a perceived insult to a woman who was with Caleb, but had smiled at Jake. That woman was Sarah Page before she was his wife. He hadn't wanted to fight the boy. He had tried to walk away. But Caleb, desperate to prove himself, had called him out. The duel was over in a heartbeat. Jake had aimed for Caleb's shoulder, a shot to wound, to humiliate, not to kill. But at the last second, Caleb stumbled. The bullet that should have taken him in the arm took him in the chest. He remembered kneeling by the boy's side, the life fading from his eyes. He remembered the look of shock, of betrayal. He remembered Silas, who had been in the crowd, rushing forward, his face a mask of unimaginable grief and hatred as he cradled his dying brother. That was the day the ghost of the canyons died. Jake had holstered his gun and walked away from that life forever. The weight of the accidental kill a shroud he would carry for the rest of his days. He had never known what happened to Caleb's body. He had assumed Silas had taken him home. He never imagined he was buried here on the land that would one day become his, the land he had shared with the very woman at the center of that fatal misunderstanding. Jake, Elena's voice was a whisper, pulling him back to the present. She was looking at him, her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. "What is it? What do you remember?" Jake finally looked at her, the guilt of 5 years etched onto his face. "I killed him," he said, his voice raw, broken. "It was an accident. But I was the one who pulled the trigger." The story was no longer about land or water rights. It was never about a poker game. It was about this forgotten grave. Silas Blackwood didn't just want his family's land back. He wanted to reclaim his brother's resting place. And he wanted to utterly destroy the man who had put him there. The discovery of the grave changed everything. The air in the cabin grew thick with the weight of Jake's confession. He became withdrawn, the guilt he had carried in silence for 5 years, now exposed, raw and festering. He would stand for hours at the window, staring out at the rocky patch of land where Caleb Blackwood lay a prisoner of his own home. Elena watched him, her heart aching for the burden he carried. She tried to talk to him, to tell him that an accident, no matter how tragic, did not make him a murderer. But he was lost in his own past, wrestling a ghost she could not see. Their fragile peace was shattered 2 days later. Jake was mending a fence at the far end of the property when he saw the rider approaching one of Blackwood's men riding hard. But he wasn't coming for Jake. He rode straight to the cabin dismounted and went inside. A cold dread seized Jake. He dropped his tools and ran. The distance felt immense, his legs pumping his lungs, burning the frantic beat of his heart, a drum of pure fear. Elena. He burst through the cabin door to find the room in disarray. The chair where Elena had been sitting was overturned. A small piece of torn fabric from her dress lay on the floor. On the table, held down by a wicked-looking Bowie knife plunged into the wood, was a single sheet of paper. Jake's hands trembled as he pulled the note free. The script was elegant, precise, a stark contrast to the brutal message it conveyed. Jake, I've grown tired of this game. Your time on my family's land is over. I have your lady friend. If you ever want to see her again, you will meet me at the abandoned church on Blackwood Ridge at sundown. Come alone, and bring the deed to the ranch signed over to me. And don't disappoint me. Us be. Rage pure and undiluted washed over him, momentarily eclipsing the fear. Silas had taken the last two things in the world that mattered to him, the locket that represented his past and the woman who represented his future. This was the confrontation Silas had been engineering all along. Not just a legal battle or a war of attrition, but a final personal reckoning. The abandoned church on Blackwood Ridge. It was a desolate, forgotten place, miles from town, visible for miles around. A place where a man could not hide. A place for a showdown. Jake went to the loose floorboard beneath his bed. His fingers brushed against the cold, familiar leather of his old gun belt. He hadn't touched it in 5 years. The holsters were stiff, the Colt Peacemakers heavy and cold. As he strapped the belt around his waist, the weight felt both foreign and terrifyingly familiar. He was putting on the skin of a man he had tried to kill and bury, the ghost of the canyons. He found the deed to the ranch in a small lockbox, his signature on the transfer line, a small death in itself. But the land meant nothing without Elena. His promise to Sarah had been to build a quiet life. He had failed in that. But he could still honor his own promise, the one he'd made to himself when he took Elena in to protect her. He knew this was a trap. Silas likely had no intention of letting either of them walk away. But it was a trap he had to walk into. He had been running from the consequences of that day in the street for 5 years. The running stopped tonight. He was no longer trying to escape his violent past. He was going to have to embrace it to save Elena, risking becoming the very killer Silas already believed him to be. As he rode out, the setting sun bled across the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the land. He was no longer Jake the rancher. He was a man riding toward a battle he knew he might not survive, a battle for a woman's life, and for the last tattered remnants of his own soul. The church on Blackwood Ridge was a skeletal silhouette against the blood-red sky. Its steeple was a broken finger pointing accusingly at the heavens, and its windows were vacant eyes staring out over the valley. A fierce dust storm was kicking up the wind, howling through the broken panes, rattling the decaying structure to its foundations. It was a fitting arena for ghosts. Jake dismounted at the edge of the clearing, the wind tearing at his clothes, stinging his eyes with sand. He walked toward the church, the signed deed in one hand, his other hovering over the butt of his Colt. The heavy church doors groaned open before he reached them. Silas Blackwood stood in the doorway, a lantern in one hand, casting dancing demonic shadows on his face. Punctual, he said, his voice calm, almost serene. I do appreciate that in a man. Jake stepped inside. The interior of the church was a wreck of fallen timbers and shattered pews. In the center of the room, Elena was tied to a chair, a gag in her mouth. Her eyes were wide with fear, but when she saw Jake, a flicker of defiance burned through it. She was alive. That was all that mattered, was all. Two of Silas's men stood in the shadows, rifles held at the ready. "The deed," Silas said, holding out his hand. Jake held it up. "Let her go first." Silas laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "No, I don't think so. This is not a negotiation. This is a penance. Your penance." He began to pace his movements, agitated the calm facade, finally cracking to reveal the raw grief beneath. "Do you know what it's like to watch your brother die in your arms? He was 17, Jake. 17. He was foolish and proud. But he was my blood. And you shot him down in the street like a dog over a misunderstanding." For the first time, Jake let the truth of his own regret surface. "I never wanted to kill him, Silas. I aimed for his shoulder. He stumbled. It was an accident." "An accident," Silas roared, the word echoing in the cavernous space. "There are no accidents when a man like you draws a gun. There is only cause and effect. You caused his death, and the effect is that you will pay for it with everything you have." He snatched the deed from Jake's hand and glanced at the signature. "This land, this was supposed to be his. Our father lost it, shamed our name, but it was still our home. Caleb is buried here, on land owned by his killer. Do you have any idea of the irony, the poison of it?" "Silas, this has to end," Jake said, taking a small step forward. "This won't bring him back." "No," Silas agreed, his voice dropping to a tormented whisper, "but it will bring justice." As the standoff reached its peak, Elena, who had been struggling against her bonds, managed to work the gag loose. "It's a lie, Silas," she yelled, her voice hoarse. Silas spun around, startled by her outburst. "What did you say?" "The land," Elena cried, her eyes blazing. "Your ancestral right. It's a lie you tell yourself. I saw the records. Your father didn't just lose the land in a card game. It was a legal witness sale. He was desperate for money, and Walter Page. Sarah's father paid him a fair price for it. He didn't gamble it away. He sold it." The revelation struck Silas like a physical blow. The moral high ground he had built his entire vendetta upon crumbled into dust. His family's honor hadn't been lost. It had been sold. His quest for justice was just a selfish, violent fantasy built on a foundation of shame. The truth did not calm him. It shattered him. "Liar." He shrieked, his face contorting into a mask of pure rage. He drew his pistol, but he didn't aim it at Jake. He aimed it at Elena. Everything happened in a fraction of a second. Jake drew his Colt, the motion fluid, instinctive, a muscle memory he had prayed he would never need again. A shot rang out. Then another. Silas cried out, stumbling backward, clutching a blossoming red stain on his shoulder. His own shot went wide, splintering the wooden chair inches from Elena's head. His two men raised their rifles, but Jake was already moving, diving behind a fallen pew as their shots ripped through the air where he had been standing. The dust storm outside raged, whipping sand and debris through the broken windows, obscuring everything in a swirling brown haze. It was a battle of shadows and sound. Jake fired twice, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the terrified face of one of the hired guns before he fell. The other man panicked, fired blindly into the gloom. Jake used the chaos to move circling around the edge of the room. He saw the remaining gunman trying to get a clear shot at him. He also saw Silas wounded, but still on his feet, struggling to reload his pistol, his eyes still fixed on Elena with murderous intent. He had a choice: take out the gunman or stop Silas. He didn't hesitate. He rose from behind his cover and fired. The bullet struck the gunman's rifle, sending it spinning from his hands. The man stared at his empty, stinging fingers for a second before turning and bolting out into the storm. Now it was just him and Silas. Jake walked slowly into the center of the room, his gun leveled. Silas had managed to reload his pistol, and he held it with a trembling hand, still aimed at Elena. "It's over, Silas," Jake said, his voice steady. "Not until my brother is avenged," Silas snarled, his face pale from blood loss and fury. "Then you'll have to kill me," Jake said. "But you won't. Because you're not a killer, Silas. You're just a man drowning in grief. And you're hiding behind your brother's memory to justify your own pain." He did the last thing Silas expected. He lowered his gun. He ejected the bullets, letting them fall to the dusty floor, and placed the empty weapon on a nearby crate. "The cycle ends here," Jake said. "I won't kill you. And you won't kill her. Because if you do, you become me. You become the thing you hate." For a long, agonizing moment, Silas stood there, his gun wavering, his mind at war with itself. The hatred in his eyes battled with a flicker of despair, of confusion. The lie that had fueled him for so long was gone, and he was left with nothing but the ugly, empty truth of his own rage. With a cry that was half sob, half roar of frustration, he threw his gun to the floor. It clattered against the stone, the sound echoing the final collapse of his vendetta. Just then, the church doors swung open. Sheriff Miller stood there, flanked by 2 deputies, his shotgun held at the ready. "Heard some commotion up here," the sheriff said, his weary eyes taking in the scene. He nodded toward Silas, who had slumped to his knees, a broken man. "Looks like your bill has finally come due, Mr. Blackwood." Jake rushed to Elena's side, his knife quickly slicing through her ropes. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in his chest, her body trembling with the aftermath of terror. He held her tight, the feel of her safe and alive in his arms, the only thing that felt real in the swirling dust and chaos. He had faced his ghost, and for the first time, he had won. Not by outdrawing it, but by refusing to let it pull the trigger. In the days that followed, a fragile peace settled over the valley. The dust storm passed, washing the air clean and leaving the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Sheriff Miller confirmed that Silas Blackwood, along with the hired gun they'd captured, was on a train bound for the federal prison at Yuma. His empire, built on a lie, had crumbled overnight. Back at the ranch, Jake and Elena moved through the quiet rhythm of recovery. She tended to the new set of bruises he'd acquired, and he tended to the lingering fear in her eyes. They didn't talk much about what had happened in the church. The events were too raw, the emotions too close to the surface. Instead, they spoke of the future. They planned where to plant a small garden, how best to reinforce the corral before winter. They spoke of small, simple things, building a new reality for themselves, one quiet moment at a time. One afternoon, the sheriff rode out to the ranch, something tucked under his arm. It was a small cloth-wrapped parcel. "Found this when we were going through Blackwood's things at his office," Miller said, handing it to Jake. "Figured it belonged to you." Jake's hands were unsteady as he unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay the silver locket. It was tarnished and slightly dented, but it was whole. He opened it. Sarah's tiny portrait smiled up at him, her eyes seeming to hold a light of their own. For 5 years, this object had been a symbol of his grief, a chain that bound him to the past. Now, holding it again, it felt different. It felt like a memory, precious, but no longer all-consuming. He looked up at Elena, who stood on the porch watching him, her expression soft and understanding. He saw his future in her eyes. "Thank you, Sheriff," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. After Miller left, Jake and Elena stood on the porch for a long time, the silence comfortable and deep. "Are you okay?" she finally asked. "I am now," he said, and he knew it was the truth. The ghost that had haunted him was gone, not vanquished by a bullet, but laid to rest by a choice. The choice not to kill Silas. The choice to build something new instead of dwelling in the ruins of the past. This ranch, Elena set her gaze sweeping over the rugged, beautiful land. It's been a place of so much pain. For you. For the Blackwoods. It has, Jake agreed. But it doesn't have to be. We can make it a place of healing. They were no longer just two survivors thrown together by circumstance. They were partners. He was no longer a man defined by the man he had killed, and she was no longer a woman defined by the man she had fled. They had saved each other, and in doing so had found a way to save themselves. The next morning, they walked together to the northern edge of the property, to the two graves that stood as silent monuments to the ranch's troubled history. One was the well-tended plot beneath the mesquite tree where Sarah lay. The other was the neglected pile of stones that marked Caleb Blackwood's final resting place. They spent hours working on Caleb's grave. They cleared away the weeds and scrub brush. They found sturdy flat stones and built a proper cairn, solid and respectful. Jake took a piece of weathered lumber from the barn, and with his knife carefully carved a new marker. It was simple, bearing only the name and the year of his death. He drove it firmly into the earth at the head of the grave. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. An act of atonement. An apology that could never be spoken, but could perhaps be shown. When they were finished, he stood for a long moment, looking from Caleb's grave to Sarah's. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket. He held it in his palm, and the silver warm from the sun. He looked at Sarah's smiling face. And then he looked at Elena, who stood beside him, her hand finding his. With a gentle click, he closed the locket. He did not put the chain around his neck. Instead, he slipped the locket deep into his pocket. He was honoring his past, but he was no longer shackled by it. His heart was no longer a relic in a silver case. It was a living thing beating in his chest, ready for a new chapter. He squeezed Elena's hand, and together they turned to look out at the vast expanse of their land. The sun was rising, chasing the last shadows from the canyons, and bathing the world in a clean, golden light. A new day was beginning, a new life. One founded not on running away, but on forgiveness, shared strength, and the courage to build a future together. A week later, the stagecoach delivered a letter. It was addressed to Elena, the handwriting formal and familiar. It was from her father. She opened it with trepidation, expecting words of anger, of disownment. But the words on the page were not what she expected. Her father wrote that breaking the engagement with Silas Blackwood had nearly ruined him financially. But he admitted it had also been a strange kind of liberation. It had forced him to sell off the superficial trappings of his wealth and rebuild his business from the ground up, this time honestly, without cutting corners or making deals with corrupt men. He expressed a grudging but sincere respect for the courage she had shown. He didn't understand her choice, he wrote, but he was beginning to understand her. Tucked inside the letter was a bank draft for a small sum of money. A note at the bottom read, "Not a dowry, a starting gift for your new life." Tears welled in Elena's eyes as she showed the letter to Jake. Her act of defiance, her desperate flight for freedom, had not just saved herself. It had, in its own small way, set her father free as well. The seeds of forgiveness she was learning could grow in the most unexpected soil. She looked at Jake, at the quiet strength in his eyes, at the home they were building in the heart of the wild desert. And she knew with absolute certainty that she had run to the right place.